You survived something your neighbor did not. That is the only reason you are here. Not because your ancestors were stronger, smarter, or blessed by fortune. Because they carried mutations that happened to be slightly less incompatible with a pathogen that killed nearly everyone else. Evolution does not reward the best. It keeps whoever remains standing when the fire goes out. And one of history's largest fires burned through medieval Europe so completely that it rewrote the genetic code of an entire continent. The Black Death arrived in 1347 and killed between 75 and 200 million people over the next 5 years. Historians estimate that Europe lost somewhere between 30 and 60% of its population. Entire villages vanished. Fields returned to forest. Labor became so scarce that wages doubled and social hierarchies collapsed. That part is taught in schools. What is rarely mentioned is that the plague did not just remove people. It removed genetic variants. If you carry a particular immune gene today, you probably inherited it from someone who survived the plague, not because they were healthier in general, but because that gene happened to interfere with the bacteria's invasion pathway just enough to tip survival odds a few percentage points higher. Those few points, multiplied across millions of deaths, created one of the strongest genetic bottlenecks in human history. The plague was a filter. The people who passed through it were not the fittest. They were the least incompatible. And the traits that came along for the ride were not always the ones you would choose. Let's start with height. Northern Europeans today are among the tallest populations on Earth. The Netherlands averages around 183 centimeters for men. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Germany follow closely. This was not always true. Skeletal evidence from medieval Europe shows that average height increased measurably in the generations immediately following major plague outbreaks. Why would a pandemic make survivors taller? It probably did not target short people. It targeted immune profiles. But immune function is tangled with growth, metabolism, inflammation, and energy allocation. Genes do not operate in isolation. They cluster in networks. If natural selection suddenly favors a particular immune variant, it drags along whatever else sits nearby on the chromosome. Some of those hitchhiking genes influence bone growth, hormone signaling, and childhood development. The result is not intentional. It is mechanical. A disease killed millions. The survivors carried a narrow set of genetic combinations. Some of those combinations happened to correlate with increased adult height. The trait spread not because being tall helped anyone survive the plague, but because the immune variants that did help were physically linked to growth-related genes. Evolution does not care about your goals. It keeps whatever works right now and lets the side effects sort themselves out later. This is not unique to height. Researchers have found that certain immune genes common in modern European populations show signs of intense positive selection during and after the medieval plague period. One example is a cluster of genes related to the immune system's ability to recognize and attack bacterial invaders. Variants that enhanced that recognition increased in frequency dramatically after the Black Death. Those same variants are associated with higher baseline inflammation, which helps fight acute infections but raises long-term risk for autoimmune disorders and chronic inflammatory diseases. You inherit the thing that kept your ancestor alive long enough to reproduce. You also inherit the bill. Northern Europeans today have elevated rates of conditions such as Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, and type 1 diabetes. Not every case traces to plague-selected genes, but population-level patterns suggest that some of the immune intensity that helped survive 14th century bacteria now misfires against the body's own tissues in the 21st century. That is the trade. Your immune system is tuned to fight an invasion that ended 700 years ago. It still expects the invasion. Now consider smallpox. Smallpox killed an estimated 300 million people in the 20th century alone. Before that, it ravaged populations for thousands of years. Case fatality rates in unvaccinated people ranged from 20 to 30% for ordinary smallpox, with hemorrhagic and flat forms approaching or reaching total lethality. It left survivors scarred, sometimes blind, and carrying genetic variants that had helped them survive. One of those variants is a mutation in a gene called CCR5. CCR5 is a protein that sits on the surface of certain immune cells. It acts as a receptor, a doorway that some pathogens use to enter the cell. A deletion mutation called CCR5 delta 32 produces a non-functional version of that receptor. People who inherit 2 copies of the deletion are almost completely resistant to HIV infection because the virus cannot efficiently enter their cells without a working CCR5 doorway. People who inherit 1 copy have slower disease progression if infected. This mutation is common in Northern Europe, approaching 10 to 16% carrier frequency in some populations. It is rare or absent in Africa, East Asia, and the Americas. That distribution tells a story. The mutation probably arose thousands of years ago, but it increased in frequency relatively recently. Genetic dating and population models suggest it was under strong positive selection sometime in the last 2,000 years, with the selection pressure peaking during the medieval period. Smallpox is the leading candidate for what drove that selection. The virus does not use CCR5 to enter cells, but immune response to smallpox involves the same pathways CCR5 regulates. Disrupting that receptor might have altered inflammatory responses just enough to improve survival odds during infection. So, a mutation that protects against HIV in the 21st century probably spread because it helped people survive smallpox in the 10th. HIV did not create the shield. Smallpox did. By the time HIV arrived, the mutation was already waiting in millions of people who had no idea they carried it. This raises an uncomfortable question. If past diseases shaped which genes survived, are we still being shaped right now? Yes. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people. Mortality was unusually high among healthy young adults, possibly because their stronger immune systems triggered overwhelming inflammatory responses. Researchers analyzing descendants of survivors have found differences in genes related to immune signaling and cytokine production. The selection pressure lasted only 2 years, but it was intense enough to leave measurable genetic signatures. COVID-19 has now infected hundreds of millions. Severe outcomes correlate with specific genetic variants affecting immune response, blood clotting, and inflammation. It is too early to measure whether those variants will decrease in frequency over generations, but the principle is the same. A pathogen does not care about fairness. It kills some people and spares others. Genes that correlate with survival become more common. Genes that correlate with death become rarer. That is not improvement. It is filtration. The genome you carry is not optimized. It is whatever survived the last filter. And the filters keep changing. Malaria has shaped human genetics more than almost any other disease. It remains one of the strongest ongoing sources of natural selection in human populations. Sickle cell trait, where a person inherits 1 copy of the sickle hemoglobin mutation, provides significant protection against severe malaria. 2 copies cause sickle cell disease, a serious condition. 1 copy improves survival in malaria endemic regions, enough that the mutation persists at high frequencies despite its cost. That is selection in action. The trait is harmful in one context and protective in another. Evolution does not remove it because the protection outweighs the harm in the environment where it arose. If malaria disappeared tomorrow, the sickle cell allele would slowly decline over generations because it would lose its advantage. If a new malaria-like pathogen emerged, selection could push it higher again. Your genome is a record of compromises negotiated with parasites, bacteria, and viruses across thousands of generations. Some of those compromises are still active. Tuberculosis has killed more than 1 billion people over recorded history. It remains one of the top infectious killers globally. Researchers have identified multiple genetic variants that influence TB susceptibility. Some affect the immune system's ability to wall off the bacteria inside granulomas. Others influence vitamin D metabolism, which plays a role in immune defense. Populations with long histories of TB exposure carry different frequencies of these variants compared to populations where TB arrived recently. That means your ancestors' disease environment is still visible in your DNA. It also means that modern medicine, which can cure TB with antibiotics, has only recently interrupted a selection pressure that operated for millennia. Without treatment, the pressure returns. We think of evolution as slow. It is slow when the environment is stable. When the environment kills 30% of a population in 5 years, evolution is fast. The Black Death was not the only accelerator. The Justinianic plague in the 6th century, smallpox epidemics across centuries, repeated cholera pandemics, and tuberculosis all applied selection pressure intense enough to shift allele frequencies in measurable ways. Each event was a catastrophe for individuals. Each event was also a genetic experiment at population scale. The results are still inside you, not because your ancestors were the strongest, because they were the least incompatible with whatever was killing everyone else. And incompatibility is temporary. The same immune intensity that helped survive plague increases autoimmune risk today. The same CCR5 deletion that protects against HIV might worsen outcomes in West Nile virus infection. The same inflammatory responses that clear one pathogen can trigger lethal cytokine storms against another. Evolution does not solve problems permanently. It makes deals with the present and lets the future pay the interest. You are the interest. So when you read that Northern Europeans are taller on average, that is not merely diet and prosperity. Some of it is the shadow of a plague that ended before the printing press existed. When you read that certain populations have higher rates of specific autoimmune diseases, that is not purely bad luck. Some of it is the echo of selection pressures that saved lives during bacterial pandemics and now misfire in environments those immune systems never encountered. When you read that a small percentage of people are naturally resistant to HIV, that is not a random gift. It is the residue of smallpox, repurposed by chance into protection against a virus that did not exist when the mutation spread. Your immune system is not defending you against the diseases you face. It is defending you against the diseases your ancestors faced. That is why it sometimes gets confused. That is why it sometimes attacks the wrong target. That is why some people survive infections that kill others, and why those differences are not always fair, not always explainable by behavior or circumstance. Genetics is history written in molecules. And the history of human genetics is overwhelmingly the history of disease, not the diseases we conquered. The diseases that conquered us and left survivors carrying the receipts. The Black Death made some people taller. Smallpox made some people resistant to HIV. Malaria made some people carry sickle cell. Tuberculosis shaped vitamin D pathways. Influenza tuned cytokine responses. None of that was intentional. All of it was mechanical. A pathogen killed millions. A gene variant changed survival odds by a few percentage points. The variant spread. The trait came along. Repeat across thousands of years and hundreds of pathogens, and you get the modern human genome. It is not a blueprint. It is a survivor's manual, written by disasters you did not experience, optimized for threats you will never face, and carrying costs you are still paying. And it is still being written, because the diseases have not stopped. The filters have not stopped. They have only changed shape. The next pandemic will do the same thing the last ones did. It will kill some people and spare others. Genes that help will become more common. Genes that hurt will become rarer. That is not a prediction. It is a certainty. Evolution does not pause because you built hospitals. It only pauses when selection stops. And selection stops when nothing dies. We are not there yet. So the next time someone mentions that you are taller than your great-great-grandparents, or that your immune system behaves differently than someone from another part of the world, or that a disease affects populations unevenly in ways that do not match obvious environmental factors, remember this. You are not standing here because your ancestors were better. You are standing here because they were slightly less worse at surviving something that killed nearly everyone else. The disease did not make you taller. It made the tall ones slightly more likely to carry the genes that mattered. And you inherited the combination. That is not strength. It is luck, written into chromosomes and mistaken for destiny. The plague is over. The selection is not.